I've always been iffy on AIOs. They've always promised better performance than air, but then I run my benchmarks and it turns out more like sort of better performance in certain metrics as compared to air. But NZXT's latest AIO, the Kraken X53, handily stops that trend. Howdy guys, Ponchato here, and today we're checking out the Kraken X53 liquid cooler provided by NZXT. It has a number of improvements over the previous Kraken generations, and they come together to make a very compelling CPU cooler. Let's take a look. The X53 was released recently in January of 2020 for around $130 US. It's compatible with every major socket today: AM4, LGA1151, 2066, the upcoming LGA1200, and Threadripper sockets. Being an AIO, it has unlimited RAM clearance and no interference with the PCIe slot, so compatibility with other components in your case won't be an issue. NZXT doesn't rate it for a specific TDP, but based on my benchmarks, I estimate it can handle somewhere north of 350 watts. I don't have any components on hand that come close to stressing it to that point, so that's kind of an extrapolation. It can cool a lot. You'll see that in a bit. Taking a look inside the box, you'll find NZXT's nicely illustrated instructions right on top, which do a great job of explaining the actually very simple installation procedure. After that, you have the two 120mm fans, the mounting hardware, all the cables to hook it up, and finally the cooler itself. The centerpiece of the X53 is the 7th gen Asetek pump with a striking RGB infinity mirror faceplate. Compared to NZXT's previous generation, the LED ring on the X53 is 10% larger, and the logo can be rotated to suit whatever orientation your motherboard is in. And the pump is also 30% quieter than the previous Kraken generation. That's no small amount. NZXT also built an RGB channel into the pump to allow the addition of any NZXT RGB products like the Air RGB2 fans or LED strips. The pump has an 80 by 80mm footprint and is 55mm tall, so clearance won't be an issue in the vast majority of cases. The cold plate is machined copper and has thermal paste pre-applied to help simplify the installation process. The pump runs at 800 to 2800 RPM, which allows for very quiet operation at idle, something I've complained about a lot with other AIOs before. But that decrease in noise level over previous generations is very noticeable. At full speed, the pump is about as loud as a typical 120mm fan running at maybe 600 or 800 RPM. At its minimum speed, you can really only hear it if you stick your ear right next to the pump. The RPM is controlled internally, so the 3-pin fan connector is only used to monitor the RPM. The pump RPM curve is controlled in NZXT's CAM software, and the default curve runs it at 1800 RPM until the CPU hits 50 degrees Celsius, above which it runs at full speed. And that curve can be fully customized in the software to fit whatever noise and performance profile you want. The mounting system for the pump can be adjusted in 30-degree increments for a wide range of flexibility with where you route the coolant tubes. The coolant tubes are 400mm long and made of ultra low evaporation rubber with a nice nylon mesh sleeve. The sleeving adds strength to the tubing and, importantly, adds protection in case they end up against any sharp edges in your PC. The radiator is fairly typical for a 240mm AIO. As aluminum fins, it's 123mm tall, 275 wide, and 30mm thick, and of course it's all black. The fans are NZXT's 7-blade Air P120 model with chamfered intake to improve airflow and noise performance. They run at an RPM range of 500 to 2000 and have a fluid dynamic bearing. To me, these fans look more like they're optimized for airflow than static pressure as you'd expect for radiator fans, but as we'll see later in the benchmarks, they're actually very well tuned for this role. For vibration isolation, the fan mounting holes have rubber liners to isolate the mounting screws from the fan chassis, helping to prevent a bit more noise. NZXT also includes a second set of mounting screws for a push-pull setup on the radiator. Here's the graph of the RPM range and RPM when normalized to 40 decibels. Compared to most other coolers I've reviewed, these fans are at the higher end of RPM range, but slightly lower in their normalized noise efficiency. The installation process is pretty easy compared to most AIOs I've tested. The first step is threading risers onto the stock backplate to prepare the motherboard. After that, if you're on an AM4 system, you swap out the pre-installed Intel pump mounting bracket for the AM4 pump mounting bracket, which just involves slightly rotating the brackets to lock or unlock them to the pump. After that, you set the pump down on the CPU, lining up the mounting holes with the risers, and the last step for mounting the pump is tightening it down with the 4 thumb screws. Next, on the radiator side, the 2 fans get screwed down onto the radiator. When you're doing this part, think about how you're going to mount the radiator inside your case so you can rotate the fans so their wires are easier to deal with. The last part is plugging in all the wires, and there are quite a few. The pump connects to an internal USB header, a fan or pump header is for monitoring the RPM, SATA power cable to power the pump, and the NZXT RGB connector if you'll be using it. Next, the fans need to be plugged in, and on a mini ITX motherboard like this, that'll require a separate PWM-Y splitter since I I only have one case fan connector. The RGB LEDs on the pump are pretty sweet and a definite upgrade from the previous generation. The infinity mirror ring has 8 LEDs around the outside, customizable down to the color of each individual LED if you want to go that extreme with your lighting. The logo has its own separate RGB channel, so its color or effect can be set independently from the ring. NZXT includes 25 lighting effects with the standards like spectrum wave, fading, and static color. But they also include some cool reactive effects based on the CPU temperature, GPU temperature, or current FPS. And if you have other NZXT RGB components in your case, they can be run from the pump with the Hue 2 connector. Now let's go to the benchmarks. First, I'll note this on the pump RPM. All the tests were run with the default pump RPM curve. You could force it to run faster at lower temperatures, but there's not much point unless you want to keep idle temperatures even lower than they already are. And you could also force it to run slower at higher temperatures to reduce noise, but the pump is such a minor contribution to noise under load that there's really no reason not to have it running at full speed in those situations. First, we'll look at the idle temperatures. With a 240mm radiator and two 120mm fans running at their minimum RPM of 500, the Kraken keeps things very cool under idle conditions, only 4 degrees above ambient. Even in a hot room, that's still under 30 degrees Celsius absolute CPU temperature. So idle conditions are kept more than cool enough. Here are the idle noise levels. The Kraken X53 keeps things very quiet, but not completely inaudible. If the fan's RPM range were expanded down to 300 RPM at the minimum, I think it could be effectively silent. An important factor in this is how quiet the pump is. Other AIOs I've tested have had very noisy pumps, even at idle, whereas this one is very nearly silent. That's a huge factor in liquid cooler noise, and I'm very happy to see this generation finally clamping down on that issue. Now here are the load temperatures, with the coolers running at their maximum RPM. Here you can see the notable superiority of the X53, beating even the Deepcool Assassin 3, the strongest air cooler I've ever tested, by more than 1.5 degrees. I've long been of the opinion that 240mm and smaller AIOs are matched or outperformed by high-end air coolers. And to get the fabled superior cooling of liquid, you need to have a 280 or 360mm radiator. It looks like the Kraken X53 ended that trend because it is firmly the strongest cooler I've ever tested with this setup. But I didn't say that that cooling comes for free. In addition to being the most effective cooler I've tested, it's also almost the loudest, being outclassed only by the Wraith Prism, which tops out at a fairly ridiculous 3600 RPM. However, maximum cooling and maximum noise only tell part of the story. The rest of it comes from temperatures normalized to noise. This is where the Kraken X53 solidifies its lead. When normalized to 40 decibels, the X53 outperforms Arctic's Liquid Freezer 2 240mm AIO by nearly 1.5 degrees, and the Deepcool Assassin 3 by more than 2. When you're dealing with the highest end air coolers available, that is a significant difference in noise-adjusted performance. Bravo to NZXT, this is very impressive. So the Kraken X53 is the strongest cooler I've tested and also the most noise efficient, both by a pretty big margin. And it's not insanely priced, only a little step up in cost from top-end air coolers that it beats. The performance is very impressive, hands down. But I do have some gripes with it. Not deal breakers, but things that I think could be improved in future iterations. First, they don't include a Y splitter for the radiator fans. That's not a problem if you're running a micro or full ATX motherboard with multiple case fan headers, but on boards with only one fan header, you have to buy a Y splitter separately. Second, there are a lot of wires to deal with. 2 wires from the fans, the power cable for the pump, the USB cable, the pump fan header, and the RGB connector. Typically, you're only going to have to deal with the cable management once, but I think it'd be great to see NZXT figure out ways to reduce the number of cables. One way could be to shorten the radiator fan cables and instead have a single long PWM Y splitter. Kill 2 birds with 1 stone. But even with those downsides, the performance of the X53 speaks for itself. And NZXT gives it a 6-year warranty, which is quite a long time, especially for a liquid cooler. A company standing by its product's longevity is always something to appreciate. So if you're in the market for a very high capacity cooler for a new build, or you just want a massive upgrade in temperature and noise compared to your existing CPU cooler, the Kraken X53 from NZXT is well worth the cost. Click the link in the description below to pick one up for yourself. Hit subscribe and click that bell icon to get notified of new videos as soon as they're up. If you like this video, hit the like button. If you want to see more, hit subscribe, and I want to hear from you. Would you consider transitioning from air cooling to an AIO to get performance like this? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching. I hope I helped, and I'll see you in the next video. These quarantine haircuts are taking a lot out of me. I still don't even know if the back of my head, looks okay. At least maybe this will all be over soon. Or not. Who knows? I'm about to just buzz it all off.